Over to you, Justin.
Eric, thank you, my boy, for the kind intro. Guys, I've just noticed on the video here, we've got some algebra in the background here. You won't be needing that tonight, that's for sure. This is very much a relaxed conversation. I do encourage you to, if you have any questions, please just put your hand up and we'll jump straight in. You know, I'm coming at this from a purely passion perspective. You know, I'm one of those guys that's been lucky enough, thank you, to have found a profession that didn't exist when I was at university. You know, I'm lucky enough to have been able to forge a passion into work. But my wife, you know, I'm still trying to convince her that it is work. And of course, days like today, racing around a track with some watches and some cars doesn't help that conversation. But no, it's a pleasure to be here. And actually, I never thought in a million years I'd be walking the halls of this place, because I certainly wouldn't have been even considered for an application. So it's great to be here with you, and especially to talk watches. So thank you, Eric, for the kind introduction. Can we get the first slide up there? How do we
Just click the mouse or the keyboard.
the keyboard?
Down, press right.
Oh, which one? Sorry, go. Oh, sorry, forgive me. There we go. Brilliant. Right, we're in. So guys, what we'll do is we'll cover off a little bit about my story, what it was that got me interested in the subject, how that journey has unfolded to where I am today. We'll then talk about the market. We've recently had some data come out from Morgan Stanley, which was really interesting about the last year. And then we've even got some data on the last 5 years. And then we'll get to the point that we get to talk watches and some of my watches, and that's probably the most exciting bit. So, you know, but feel free to jump in as and when you like. So this was, let me take you back to the very beginning. This was my first watch. This is an Omega Constellation. I'm originally from South Africa, and I never got to meet my grandparents. And this belonged to my grandfather on my father's side. And I had never really taken a great deal of interest in anything material, actually, up until my 21st birthday. And like so many of us, you know, be it watches, be it cards or trinkets or whatever it might be, that the connection beyond the product is what really makes this whole thing special. And this watch just spoke to me. I got it for my 21st, as I say, and it just really lit me up. I took it to the Omega boutique. They were excited when I walked in with it. It was beaten up. And they wanted me to get it serviced, and I honestly didn't know what the hell that meant, and I knew that it was expensive, and so I had to grab my mum's card and without her seeing it, and paid for this, which probably wasn't a million miles away from the value of the watch at the time. You know, it was certainly 500-600 quid for the service. I didn't know what they were going to do with it. They just said, let's take it off the aftermarket gold bracelet that was on, and let's put a leather strap on it, which looked a lot like an Hermes strap. And it came back a couple of months later, and I just couldn't quite get my head around this magic. And it's cliche, but I was kindly interviewed by some guys at Square Mile magazine the other day for the Royal Oak's 50th anniversary, and I said something like, you know, watches chose me, I didn't choose watches, and that is a cliche thing to say, but this whole journey for me has not been something I went looking for. I just have felt this overwhelming wave of passion for the subject that has taken me to some pretty cool places, and having had some cool watches in the hand. So that's the first watch, the Constellation, interestingly designed by Gerald Genta, not one of the well-known designs from his roster, but certainly one of the more interesting in my view. When I left university, I did go to university, only just graduated from Loughborough, and I started working in a whole bunch of different fields. I ran a business with a friend of mine for 2 or 3 years, which was a marketing business, where we had a little unit at Westfield Shopping Centre in Shepherd's Bush. It was like my mini MBA, because we were robbed so many times, we were sued so many times, I didn't know what to do, but it taught me a huge amount about life and business. I then got a call when I started writing about watches and taking photos of watches, just as a side project. You know, I started this website called cancono.com. And it was this incredible vehicle that I'd never experienced before, because I could support the people and the brands I liked. I could have conversations with them. I had a reason to be in the room that I'd never experienced anything before. And I started writing and shooting. And then I got a call out of the blue from Revolution magazine's editor in the UK, Tracy Llewellyn, who's one of the sort of premier editorial voices, actually. Doesn't like the limelight. She's very much in the background. She's now at Telegraph Time. But she said, you know, we're looking for someone, and we've heard that you're okay. You know, someone at Vacheron said you're a decent guy. Do you want to come and take a job with us as the UK editor and online editor? And, you know, I just thought, my God, thought this might be the opportunity of a lifetime. And I dropped the job that I moved on from the business stuff we were running, and I thought, look, let's give this a crack. Ended up at Revolution for a year under the tutelage of Wei Ko, who's quite an interesting media character you guys might be familiar with. Based in Singapore, started the Rake magazine and Revolution. And really what's interesting to me about this is that he connected, and forgive me, whoever knows him out there, he's a lovely man, but he's not always the easiest to work with. But what he did do, which was magic, was he connected lifestyle to watches. And watches alone are nothing. They're nothing really. But when they're connected to lifestyle, they are a wonderful world that has storytelling at its core. So Revolution magazine, I spent a good year there, which I really enjoyed. I then had the opportunity to work freelance for a number of places. Monochrome Watches is a big Dutch publication, online publication, founded by an ex-member of parliament, Frank Gielen in The Hague. Really interesting guy, and a few of these key players online have really seen their trajectory go through the roof in the last few years. Watches by SGX, Monochrome, Hodinkee, Revolution. These key players that were early on the digital scene have really reaped the rewards, and you can see them now commercializing in really interesting ways. But I had a great time in this particular series interviewing some really interesting characters around the world in the collector series. One watch, one story, and we wrote like 1,000, 2,000 words on each watch. So that gives you an insight into how deep this very bizarre and obscure passion actually runs for people who care about it. This might be my favorite story that I've ever written. It was the story I wrote for Hodinkee a few years after that, about a watch designed by a pig. A swatcher very much in the headlines right now after their launch the other day of the Moon Swatch, which was a fascinating case study in of itself. But this story was great because this dial was designed by a pig who had the brush in the mouth, and he was actually drawing it allegedly by hand. I've just actually, funnily enough, just ordered a watch from Bulgari, the Octo Finissimo Sketch, which is not dissimilar to this, but a little bit more eloquent in its design. So I really enjoyed this because to me, watches are about fun and they're about storytelling. If I saw this on the wrist of someone across the room, I'd have to go and have a chat with them. So there we go. We then moved into another phase of my journey, which was working for brands. And now this is a controversial space because traditionally in the media world, you know, it's sacrilege to work for someone who is also paying the bills, if you like. So in many ways, the watch world is slightly different, I think, because we typically talk about the things we love. We don't necessarily go out of our way to talk about the things we don't love. So to me, this felt like an interesting move. IWC, part of Richemont Group, have always been the forerunners in the storytelling business. They are a great marketing business. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. We see them on the wrist of Lewis Hamilton winning on the weekend. We see it in the stands at Wimbledon on Bradley Cooper's wrists. They are brilliant, and they have really invested in their digital offering. I was lucky a couple of years ago to get the chance to be part of their video series where we looked at historical models, tying the past to the future. And IWC have been ahead of the curve in that respect, and I think they're reaping the rewards now. Their journal is second to none, and we're seeing a confluence of media outlets becoming retailers. So Hodinkee becoming a retailer, selling a loss of product, which we would have thought to be sacrilege 5-10 years ago. And we're seeing IWC become a great storyteller, employing some of the best voices in the media landscape to actually talk for them, to share for them, to be part of their story. That's been a fascinating evolution in the last few years. This was one we shot a couple of weeks ago for Watches and Wonders, the big trade show that took place a couple of weeks ago, for the first time in Geneva. And we were in the room here just talking before we started about the impacts of restrictions in the last 2 years. One of the great outcomes has been this binding of the traditional Baselworld crowd, so the Rolexes and the LVMHs of the world and the Swatch groups of the world, together with Richemont for the first time this year. So it was a monumental event, and it was mega to see so many people from around the world. And it really was something special. And this was to launch some of the new ceramic Ceratanium Top Gun pilot's watches with the head of design here, Christian Knoop, who was so much taller than me that I had to use a fairly large block to just get up to his height. But there you go. If you're on YouTube, check that out, and let's get some likes on there. Let's move on to the market, because this is fascinating. And guys, you know, you will have far greater insight into this data than I will. It's certainly how to use this data. I'm coming at it very much from a media perspective, from a collector perspective, and a passion perspective. This is the estimated market share according to retail sales from the Lux Consult, and again, this is part of the Morgan Stanley research that was done. No surprises that we see the crown top right there dominating. One of the big themes that we've seen in the last few years is that the strong have only got stronger. We've seen growth in the groups with economies of scale, and we've seen Rolex push on and continue to be dominant. It's interesting, if you've not seen any of this before in the rankings, how these brands that you may or may not be familiar with from the marketing campaigns actually come out when it comes to the percentage of the market here. So, you know, it's interesting. Rolex are producing, it's believed to be over 1 million watches a year. They cannot meet the demand, of course. You walk into a Rolex store and they all say that they're there for exhibition purposes only. So what are they actually selling? I don't know. It's a really interesting question. It's a fascinating business dilemma to be to discuss. But they are selling, of course, and certainly they wish they could be selling them for more, because they're fetching far more on the pre-owned market than they are in store. But again, another interesting case study maybe, or a question towards the end of this presentation. Cartier have had a great year, circa 7% of the market, but they are on an upward trajectory, as are AP. Interesting that they're only at 4.2, but you get the sense that they punch above their weight. Another big winner here for me is a brand that I'm particularly close with, and I'm biased, but Vacheron Constantin, the oldest brand in consecutive production years. I think 1755 they were founded. Quite incredible story, really. But they've had great growth in the last year or two, driven by the popularity of sports watches. For a brand that doesn't necessarily have the association of sports watches, they've seen some great growth. Then we have this interesting table here, which looks at a couple of years in sequence. And if you look at the top there, you know, nothing much has changed, really. Apart from what happened last year, which was that Cartier crept in over Omega. I think what they have there is they've managed to bridge the gap between changing perceptions of being a jewelry brand alone. They've also been able to connect with a lifestyle that other brands haven't. And I also think from a design perspective, they've been ahead of the curve, appreciating some of the subtleties and really understanding their market maybe more than other brands. I had the opportunity at Watches Wonders to be in the presentation with the UK market, and we had the CEO there. And what's really interesting, he's a lovely guy to start with, very, very down to earth. He was genuinely interested to speak to us, get our feedback on the Cartier Crash, which I thought was really interesting. I was wearing it. I thought it was kind of cool. You know, the odd shaped, apparently not true, but the story went that it was designed after a client brought the watch back after being in a crash, that the shape of the case had evolved to be this very unusual case. Apparently that's not entirely true, but nonetheless, it's a design that we see on the wrists of rappers at events, right? You know, and that's an interesting step change. Also, they are playing in a field of smaller case sizes, where I think we're seeing the market move towards smaller case sizes. And they were there before this happened. So they are reaping the rewards there, I think. Omega, of course, with the Moon Swatch recently having massive visibility. Don't ask me whether it was a success or failure and whether Omega won or Swatch won, I don't know. These figures are not inclusive of that, so we can't say. But maybe next year we'll see Omega start to jump back to the second place based on an increased interest in the Speedmaster. Let's see. One of the big moves here was AP coming up. If you look at AP's trajectory from 2007 and 7th place up to 4th place, whether you like Mr. Benamias as a CEO or not, the guy in the leather trench coat who presents partnerships with Marvel and others, he has done a job. He has done a job using historical designs, and some would say a one-trick pony business. They have been able to do an awful lot here. Whether you like the code 1159 or not, something is happening here which is interesting. I like their positioning. I really like their positioning. They've been relevant, but they've honored the past as well. I just hope we see some of their vintage references coming back, some of the asymmetric cases, some of those high complications, the perpetual calendars that they were so well known for 50, 70, 80 years ago. Awful lot to unpack there, guys. I mean, you know, it's hard to really appreciate what's color coding, by the way, is on groups. So we have the LVMH group, we've got Richemont Swatch Group. One final note for these recent numbers here is Patek Philippe going from 4th place in 2020, actually dropping into 6th place there. So I said this to one of the guys this evening, and I think anyone in any business who feels that they can rest on their laurels is going to suffer. And I'm not suggesting for a second that Patek Philippe, the pinnacle of what most people would consider in watchmaking terms, are going to be suffering anytime soon. But I think what there is, and certainly seeing the product this year at Watches and Wonders, there's a little bit more of a push to be relevant. There's colors in perpetual calendars. There's straps with stitching in that we would never have seen from Patek in years gone by. We've got
Justin, yeah, we have a question from the chat.
Yeah.
So Adrian Ong is saying, the Omega Swatch collaboration remains one of the most fascinating marketing / brand product strategies.
Yeah.
We'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
Especially as Omega have been pushing the price point of the Speedy up to, compete with professional Rolex models.
Who was it? The question?
Adrian.
Yeah. Adrian, thank you for the question. I feel personally attached to this because from a media perspective, I genuinely wanted to be part of this story. I went out of my way to stage an image of me camping outside the Covent Garden store because I thought on a Wednesday, for a watch that was dropping on a Saturday morning in Supreme style, right? This new model, it would be madness for a non-limited watch to have anyone camping outside the store. And I thought, let's get a few friends out. Let's get a photo of me out there. I wasn't the first. There was another guy in front of me who was going to wait and did wait till Saturday morning. I didn't wait. So I have to be honest, I didn't wait. But I just wanted to see what people's response was. And I think friends of mine who know me recognized it was piss take, but there was a lot of people that thought it was real. And I could not keep up with the conversation. So what I saw from that moment on was this incredible transition from insular watch community to broad community conversation around style, around Bitcoin, crypto, flippers, the idea of being in on a hot product that might be able to yield a quick return for people. It certainly transcended the watch community. I wanted with all my heart to walk down the queue on Saturday morning, which I did, in Covent Garden, and the queue went on and on and on, and honestly, on and on and on. I don't know if anyone was there. It went on for miles. It really went on for miles. And I wanted to believe that everyone in that queue was a watch lover like I was, and that they loved the Speedmaster design. But the truth is, it wasn't. It was hijacked by some idiots. Certainly on the day, it was hijacked. But the question you've asked is not about that. The question about what you've asked is actually, to what extent did the executives at Swatch Group plan this, and to what extent did they feel that they were successful in its execution? As I understand it, Mr. Hayek Senior, Mr. Hayek Senior, one of the best books I've ever read was The Story of Swatch, The History of Swatch. He came from an industrial background, and he applied his learnings to the business of Swatch, plastic watches, for everybody. Mr. Hayek Jr., as I understand it in this situation, basically said, there's an opportunity here. No one's taken any of their key players in their group portfolio and merged them together. We've seen collaborations across multiple sectors, but we've never seen inter-brand collaborations. All I can say is I'm just shooting from the hip here. The winner for me was Swatch. The design itself was beautiful. The case, if anyone has one, will I'm sure back me up that the case, the delivery of this case was sensational. And it really looked like the early prototypes of the model. Like when you go to a manufacturer, you see the prototyping. It looked like a prototype. It had something different to it, a beautiful touch to it. They failed in the sense that I know for a fact that there were 600 watches in the UK for that launch on the day. And up until Saturday morning of the launch, you were allowed to get 2. You were actually allowed to buy 2 as an individual. There was a miscalculation there. And I'm not a statistician, but I'm telling you now there was a problem. And interestingly, I don't think the response is as toxic. I guess understandably because of the price point, but your client who really wants a ceramic Daytona, 2016 ceramic Rolex Daytona, is going to be more upset about the perception of being taken down a path that they can't see an end to at their retailer, at their authorized dealer, when you never understand where you are in this process. And it's a big problem. And that is causing, I think, anger towards brands. I don't think people in that queue who queued for maybe a day or two, and that's a big ask, but no one asked them to do that, right? The market saw them queuing for a day or two. Swatch never asked them to sleep outside and put their life on the line. But I don't believe that they've been upset. I believe that's only stimulated more interest in the product, and I only believe that's going to mean more sales for them. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question. I don't know, some of the numbers that we saw on Chrono24 on eBay afterwards can only be a piss take. I don't understand how any of that worked. And I also don't believe that sharing the story and being part of the story was negative. I think we all, if we're interested in the industry and we're interested in watches, this is one of the most interesting phenomena we've seen in years, if not ever, quite frankly. I don't think we've ever seen anything like it. And the bottom line is, it's a bit like when we saw the introduction of the Apple Watch a couple of years ago. People thought that was a threat to the whole watch industry. Apple have become the biggest player in the space overnight almost, but that means more watches on the wrists of more people, and more watches on the wrists of more people means more watch interests and more watch conversation. So that is how I see the process. I don't think I see more Omega Speedmasters being sold. I might be wrong, but I'll be fascinated to know. Of course, we'll never really know, because Mr. Ashram and the CEO there will never tell us really what is going on. And again, this probably plays back into the story of what the watch industry is about. A little bit about smoke and mirrors when it comes to the commercials. It's very difficult to nail down what the hell's going on, even though we have this data in front of us. So I hope that goes some way to answering the question. A few key insights, guys, just coming towards the end of this presentation now. We've touched on how AP have taken Patek. I happen to be wearing a watch that I was hugely lucky to get a few years ago, the 15202 in steel with the 2121 caliber. And this is when we get geeky for those of you out there who aren't particularly interested in the watches themselves. This is where we go a little bit deeper. This is a design pioneered in the 70s, clearly a 70s design. The first sports watch in steel that when it dropped in the early 70s, people sort of laughed at the price and thought it was crazy. The industry was suffering from a number of factors, the quartz crisis being one, but most people believe the currency issue being more of an issue in the demand of mechanical watches. And AP were contrarian in their view that they came out with a steel watch that was more expensive than precious metals and larger at the time, 40 millimeters. But this caliber was inside the original one, and it's inside this one. And so I'm a big fan of AP. So there we go. Oh, wonderful watch. Thank you, sir. Oh, I can see the question coming up. Thank you. Yeah, it's a tricky one because you come in and you buy the watch, and I have to say, when you meet your heroes, sometimes they let you down. But the reason this watch is so great and so wanted is because it is so easy to wear and is such a joy to wear. And sometimes the hype system that we live in, the hype economy, the hype world we live in, does not adequately serve the products in real life. In this instance, I believe it does. That doesn't mean I believe it's worth £120,000 on the pre-owned market as it is currently worth, but it is worth £26,000, which what I paid for it with every card I had that I could put down on the table last year before it was discontinued. And then we see this increase in price as a result. But for me, as a watch lover, the idea of having the original caliber with its story, with Vacheron, with JLC, with Patek in this watch, it is not perfect. In fact, it doesn't even have a quick set date. So it's very difficult to manipulate. In fact, almost impossible to manipulate the date. And for that reason, I love it more. I didn't sum that up very well in a little video I did the other day, but that's what I meant to say was it's not perfect, but like anything in life, when it comes to the heart, imperfection actually drives more love. So second point, a big year for Richemont, big year for the groups, particularly Cartier, of course. And interestingly, this figure, watch division revenue saw a rise of 40%. Vacheron enjoyed 53% increase in sales. Really, really interesting. I'm happy to speak more about Vacheron if you'd like, because that's quite an interesting case study in of itself. Swatch Group had a good year of 30%, but below the market level. Key themes, generally speaking, from my position, and of course, I'm ultimately just a watch lover that gets to write articles, take photos, direct films, be part of multiple conversations from multiple different elements of the industry. One of my clients is an auction house. One of my clients is a pre-owned dealer in the UK. I work with IWC, I work with Vacheron, I work with Lange. So I get to see it from multiple perspectives. And thank God they don't mind that. They appreciate that actually coming to the table with lots of views of the industry is helpful to them to be able to have different insights as to how things are moving. So these are the key themes as I see it. The strong get stronger. We've touched on that already. We've seen Rolex, we've seen AP growing and continuing to grow. And I think that's a trend we'll see in the future. The rise of the hype machine and social media, that was something that we had not seen before. And while it might be negative off the bat, the reality is that we see more people like us more engaged with watches, more educated around the scholarship of watches, of course, because now when you're buying these things, they are so expensive for the most part at a certain part of the market. You want to be equipped with everything you can. It also makes connections. I wouldn't be here tonight had it not been for social media and Eric reaching out to me. And the number of friendships that I have been able to develop just through people of interest, similar interest to me, is incredible. It really is. And I think with social media, you've got to be specific about what you're talking about. Someone once said, you've got to be famous for something to me. And I couldn't quite realize what that meant until a few years ago. And I don't want to be famous, but at least I talk about watches. And I even talk about a specific part of the industry, I think, which is a certain segment. And that increasingly is becoming more and more powerful.
Sorry, Justin. Yes, so we have a question from the chat. So I think on the point of sort of all the hype.
Yeah.
So Dorzan's asking, as the Omega Swatch collab has shown, there are a lot of people present in the watch industry for quick profit, with years-long queues for professional Rolexes and skyrocketing prices for specific models, including Royal Oaks, Nautiluses, and Daytonas, to name a few. Do you think the watch industry is in a bubble? What is the future of watches as an investment perspective?
Yeah, I thought we might get that one at some point. Bearing in mind that you know, I'm early 30s, but I've been in it since I was 21. You know, I feel like I've seen it for a decade now, and I never ever liked. There were two words I never liked. Number one, iconic. Even though I said it the other day about the Royal Oak, but I think it's limited to one or two designs. And I hate the idea of investment when it comes to watches. But that's because I'm a purist. That's because I love this thing deeply. I feel like I'm a custodian to watchmaking in the smallest of ways. That if I can lift and inspire a friend to consider a mechanical watch, then that's a win. Do I think we're in a bubble? I think we're all in a bit of a bubble right now. I think the conditions that we're in politically, economically, emotionally are unusual. And I think we are in a state of flux right now. But what I would say is that we've seen over the last 2 years, people at home reading and sharing and researching watches in a whole new way that has seen more people come into the industry. And I think what we'll see is a leveling off. I think we will see a new level, as we're already seeing with a watch like this on the Prix market. The numbers have started to right themselves. And again, I'm not an economist, but I do think we're going to see a new level of interest, which is going to be higher than the level of interest 2-3 years ago. What that level looks like, I honestly don't know. I don't think we are in a bubble. I don't think we're in a traditional bubble that sees this incredible deceleration. I just don't see it. I'm speaking to brands every day, and I spoke to a wonderful brand, Laurent Ferrier, yesterday, who I said, you know, I would love this watch. I would love this watch of yours that I saw at the show. And they said, you can have it in 2024. This is a small maker who make a couple of hundred watches, if that, a year. And nothing brought me more joy than hearing that from them, because I was there 9 years ago, William & Son in Mayfair, where they could have sold, and they did sell, but there was a lot of them in the window. They were next to a lot of other independents, from Jean, from de Bethune to Moritz Grossman, and they weren't selling. So that's where we're at. We are going to see a softening off. The investment piece, do I think that if you buy a watch that you love, that's the most important thing. But I'm a purist. You've got to love it. You've got to have an emotional response to it. And I really would love to know that you're wearing it. That's the bottom line. If you happen to love the Daytona, if you happen to love a Nautilus, please God, try and buy one at a reasonable price. Please try and buy one with your name in the papers. That's even cooler, right? You can buy one new, and that if you can. But I'm not naive to the fact that we are in a state where people are looking to move these things on for profit. And one of the most interesting conversations I have frequently is with brands like AP, who dedicate a lot of human resource now to managing their sales to their clients. And actually what that does is it brings us on to a point in which, you know, the market rise of, you know, data and speculators here, point 3, we now have at our fingertips, like never before, from Chrono24 and others, data which gives us insight into how valuable these things are. That is a list price. That is not a sale price. That is always a very important point to make, because I don't think these numbers should be, speaking to a colleague today who's at a pre-owned dealer, the reality is different. The reality is different. So I hope that answers the question. That plays in nicely to my point here in 4, which is the rise of independence. Now, this is a big theme that we're seeing in watches. I'm not sure whether it's something we're seeing in other categories and industries, but I'll be fascinated to know if we are. I've always loved the idea of independent watchmaking because you get to meet the person who made the watch. You get to meet the person that designed the watch. If you've had everything, if you've had the minute repeaters from Lange, if you've had the perpetual calendars from Patek, if you're very lucky enough to be in that position, you will end up at the independents, because they will be able to, or they used to be able to, design something for you from scratch, which is really cool. And I know they've had a hard time in the last few years as well. I personally know they've had a hard time, and to see them now succeeding in the way they are is wonderful. And we've almost had this anti-hype movement as well, which is, if you rock up to the event tonight, and I can't speak because I'm wearing this, which might be the ultimate hype vehicle, except I suppose it doesn't have a Tiffany dial, but it's not far off, you know. If you rocked up to this event wearing an independent watch from Moritz Grossman, you know, that would be really, really interesting. If you had a Giro Pirago, now newly independent, that would be interesting. So we're seeing a push, an anti-establishment move. One of my favorite menswear clothing companies, Drake's, their creative director always wears a swatch, always wears a bright colored swatch, but he's in the menswear world, which is this really lovely juxtaposition. People think he should be wearing something highly complicated, but he's wearing something super simple that everyone could have. So there's this push against convention, which I like. We're seeing a rise of pre-owned. I don't know what the number is on where we think the pre-owned market is going to be in 2 or 3 years' time. I was reading Watchbox's data, which suggested it was going to rise by like 10, 20, 30% in the next few years. What's really interesting about the pre-owned market, I've always typically bought from the pre-owned market because of the variety. You can buy really interesting things that are going to set you apart from anybody else, and that's interesting. But with the rise of pre-owned, you need to be more discerning about where you're buying. So we've seen Zoops, a client of mine who I've worked with for many years, a family business, recently sold to Chrono24 in the last few weeks. That's a really interesting move. Watchfinder to Richemont a few years ago, and we see them deploying this in a really interesting way. We're seeing a lot of product. You might remember this, and it feels like a long time ago now because watches are cooking. But 5, 6, 7 years ago, Richemont had a lot of inventory that they needed to get rid of, that they were literally destroying to save the brand's reputation, right, in the marketplace, the brand equity. And they were thinking maybe that Watchfinder could be a good vehicle to push some of that product through. And we do see that still with references that aren't maybe moving as quickly. But it's really interesting. They hated the pre-owned market, and now they're working with the pre-owned market. Pre-owned market is not the enemy. I think we as consumers have the obligation to be discerning where we're buying from. And so we're seeing the rise of Watchfinder. We're seeing Watchbox, who's recently taken a lot of investment in the States, moving into bed with Hodinkee and Sons in the Middle East, one of the big retailers out there. This is really interesting, really, really interesting. So lots more to come. The ever close relationship with brand and owner, this is fascinating to me. And as I say, AP, for example, are investing a lot of money in this and a lot of human resource. And I don't know how they do it. I really don't know how they do it. I think blockchain and I think closer guarantees of ownership from a technological perspective will be one of the key weapons that these brands use in the next few years to help connect ownership and where these watches are. Because at the moment, it's very difficult to know.
I think Adrian's got an interesting remark. So he's saying the Watchfinder-Richemont relationship has distorted the market. Richemont driving the value of their own product. What would you say to that?
Well, I can't comment specifically on how they list things. You know, typically you would suggest that we would see preference to their own brands. I have to say, I spend less and less time on the Watchfinder platform purely because their core stock strategy is so clear. It's not where I find interest, quite frankly. But when I do end up on that new arrivals page, which we all inevitably do, I don't see a preference. I genuinely don't see a preference to the Richemont Group. I see a lot of Daytonas at once. I see a bunch of white dial ceramic Daytonas. I see a lot of Aquanauts all of a sudden. And this is an interesting journey into the grey market. I don't know how that's working. We have seen an interesting development from Watchfinder, which is that they plug into the retail network. So if you go to IWC on Bond Street, you can part exchange your watch off your wrist for a new watch in store that goes through Watchfinder. So they plug into the back of the retail network. You can even do it at Vacheron. Have I tried selling to them? The bid offer is spread widely. I agree, it is spread. And I have tried selling to them, and I felt, I don't know if I can swear, I felt very unloved. I cheated. I felt unloved like you, Adrian. I felt cheated. I have felt unloved, and I agree with you. I would like to see someone develop a bit of software that would aggregate or take your watch to the market and have, like we see in the car industry, like on motorway, where we see the pre-owned dealers all bidding or putting an offer in on your watch. So you have the best insights and the best visibility. Because at the moment, you and I, for sure, have used their online application and have uploaded our photos and the paperwork and the year and still felt disappointed by what we've been offered. We think about how we're going to sell direct to the customer. Are we going to put it up on Chrono ourselves? Do we want to be meeting the guy in the car park in Bishop Stortford or Hemel Hempstead on the weekend and then trying to do that transaction? Personally, I don't want to do that. I'm of the belief that I would rather go on consignment. Okay, who here wants to develop? I'll fund the platform. So I fundamentally believe, and I'll be an advisor on the board for whoever wants to set it up, that it's quite simple, that you could take 5 platforms in the UK, Watchfinder, Subdial, doing very, very interesting business, all Oxbridge guys, well-funded, Chrono24, Chronext, again, but German-based. You know, let's get 5 or 6 of the big players to sign in on this platform, to agree that they would work on it, because they are looking for inventory the whole time. One of the big issues right now, of course, is there is no inventory out there for them to buy, or not as much as they would like. So I think it makes sense. But you know what? We've had our pants pulled down countless times, and it doesn't feel good. It really doesn't. I don't know what to say there, but it's a conversation. What's the next point here? Ever closer relationship with the brand. I know I've touched on that, but what's really interesting is just how this process works. I had a friend who recently bought a new watch. He moved it on, not knowing that that would come back to bite him. He moved it on because it wasn't right. This could be a philosophy class right now. Where do we sit with this idea that if you buy a watch with your own hard-earned cash and you don't connect with it, should you feel the obligation to sit on it? Because if you don't, you're going to sell it. And the reality is they're never going to offer you a watch again. Lange with the Odysseus is a great example of a sports watch that they had massive demand for, that they will blacklist you for if you go against the agreement, the gentleman's agreement, but increasingly more contractual agreement. I've never seen one of these, but not from Lange specifically, but I gather there is more contractual obligation now than just the verbal, to say, let me have it for at least a year before we sell it. So really interesting, really, really interesting. Super retailers. Retailers, I think, have had a tough time over the last few years, especially if they never had the Rolex account or the Patek account, because we know that the way this business works is that the groups have become very keen on mono-brand boutiques. So IWC, Panerai, Jaeger, they all have their own boutiques, and they've rolled those out very aggressively around the world. But still, Rolex and Tudor perpetuate that. Well, Rolex perpetuate this idea of the retail partners being key. So that's really interesting. Those that have had Rolex have done really well. So we see Watches Switzerland, who are now traded, who acquired Mayors in America. They've posted record numbers. And I do wonder how reliant they are on Rolex, because without Rolex, they must be in an interesting place. But nonetheless, they're doing very, very well. So we're seeing that the consolidation of retailers, maybe fewer mom and pop local stores, and we're seeing this consolidation in the retail space going on.
So just I have a question on that, actually. So as you said, brands are trying to sort of gain more control over distribution, right? So they want to understand the customers better. They want to basically have a bigger piece of the pie, so to say. But do you think, obviously some brands have done it, I think, more aggressively than others. Obviously some brands under the stewardship of big conglomerates have the firepower to be able to do that without much sort of constraint, if you will. But do you think this is a sensible business model in the long run? Because you know, I'm just thinking, because we're in such good times in the market, and because there's so much demand, you know, the brands can almost sort of cover like expensive operations, retail operations themselves, right, rather than having to rely on third-party retailers. But I'm just wondering, like in the long run, say inevitably, like if there's like some sort of a downturn in the market, in the watch market, is it going to come back to sort of bite them and hurt them? And what are your thoughts on that?
So I one of the things that I have had great joy from the last few years is publishing a book called The Watch Annual, which is a community project. And I got to interview Mr. Benamias for our edition in 2019. Mr. Benamias is the CEO of AP, although the rumor is he's on his way out. But he was very aggressive at that moment in time, stating that they were moving they were pushing aside all of their retailers because they recognized they were flying, right? They could not support their retail business, their third-party retailer business. And so they wanted to take full margin and full control. I think if you are one of the top 5 brands there with the equity in your brand that can withstand that type of pressure, then I think it's a pretty cool opportunity. And I think also if you look at the retail experience and how that's evolving, the AP house, I would strongly suggest that if you get the chance to go into the AP house, go in. I think it's by appointment only. But we see AP strategy like they've got New York, Dubai, I think, and London, maybe Paris as well. But this is no longer the traditional experience that we know from the past. They have people from the Shangri-La group working in this location. This is the greatest hospitality experience you will ever have, because they recognize that actually in the long term, the winners will be the ones that can entertain and sell on your way out. You know, part of the experience is that you get to play table tennis there, you get to listen to music. There might even be a world-famous pianist playing music on the Steinway in the store while you're buying your Royal Oak, and you feel great. You know, you feel part of the family. And I think that in the long term works. Can I see that working for some of these brands that we've seen in the middle rung there? Should it even work for a Tissot? Should it even work for a Mont Blanc? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it's that important. I'm really not. But you know, even at IWC, you know, really interesting. Chris Granger, who's the CEO, took over from Georges Kern, who's now at Breitling. He's an architect by training. He came in and redid their locations. He changed the way the stores looked and felt. And now he's the CEO. So that says a lot about how they see the future of their storytelling and experience merging together. The rush for independence. We have seen in the last 12 months that Kering Group have offloaded the 2 brands they own, GP, Girard-Perregaux, and Ulysses Nadin. This was a management buyout. Both brands were underperforming. Really, I was lost for words at times in the last few years about some of the designs and how they've gone about their business. They've gone out on their own because Kering have got other profitable fashion lines and businesses that are doing well for them. They didn't want to be part of this. So it'll be fascinating to watch how they go in the next few years. We've also seen Greubel Forsey, who is a fantastic watchmaker, if you like the aesthetic, have had a minority stake ownership from Richemont Group that they no longer have. And that's interesting that they've moved away. I did put a post out suggesting that these 3 brands were departing in similar terms. And I had a quick message from Girard-Perregaux asking me for that to be taken down because it was not the case at Girard-Perregaux. It was not the case at Greubel Forsey that they were in any shape or form being bought out by the management or that it was toxic or anything. I think it was a great move on all parties, by all parties. So that was interesting. So there's a rush for independence. We've talked about the monobrand boutiques and the continued blurring line between media and retail. I see this every day in my work. The media businesses that I get the chance to interact with, write for, produce film for, feature or host in film for, they are looking for new revenues. They are no longer relying on the traditional advertising revenues that they had before. Print is back, if it ever went, I think in great form. Print can be very powerful, and I've seen that with the watch annual, but it needs to be evergreen, it needs to be community focused, and it needs to be beautiful. We sort of knew that, I think. But we've seen plugins from Watchfinder into Revolution now, which is really interesting. They tried with Watchbox, that didn't work. We're seeing Hodinkee selling table clocks. I mean, we don't need to go into we're selling leather goods. We're seeing them sell books, and it's so really expanding out and becoming interesting for everybody. Of course, the purist, those of us that were there a decade ago when Ben started it in his UBS office cubicle, will be upset by that. But I don't think it's a negative thing. If we love their storytelling, I think we also can love their design. So it's all, you know, it's really, really interesting. Finally, guys, just to close, I thought, sorry about the way this image is formatted. I thought on the presentation that it would create a nice format for me, but it didn't. And I just thought, for me, the most interesting part of all this and why we're all here is because of watches ultimately. And just a couple of the watches that I kind of never dreamt or ever thought would be possible, honestly. And I can't show my wife this photo here because she doesn't know these exist, but these are the watches that I have at home or you know, have acquired and enjoy and really want to keep forever. So, you know, let's start from the Lange one there. You know, this was a design, this one here. This was a design, 1994, Lange Söhne, based in Glashütte, which has 11, 12, 13 watch manufacturers in Germany, in this very small valley, just out of Dresden, 45 minutes out of Dresden. This design was, they were a brand that actually had to go out of business during the war because the Russians moved into the area, and they created GUB watches at that time, and then Lange was reunified during the reunification, and then 1994 the brand was relaunched by Günter Blümlein, one of the great characters of the watch industry. He was a visionary, he was an engineer, but he was a marketing genius, and he was also a capitalist. You know, he was just an amazing guy who was apparently incredibly hard to work for. But this was one of the designs they came up with, one of the 4 or 5 designs Lange introduced, and to me it always spoke to me. Some might say it's boring, but to me, the golden ratio we see here between the date and the seconds and the hours, it's a ratio that's built into us biologically. And we've seen it in design, in buildings and other things, but here we see it in watches. This is the Stealth in platinum, 38.5 millimeters, gray dial, not shiny, but a matte finish. And we are now seeing more and more scholarship into this particular family of watches. Philips in London, Philips the auction house, have run an exhibition on the Lange one and the Datograph. We're seeing scholarship that we've never seen other than in vintage Rolex before, where we're looking at dials like with a small made in Germany versus the large made in Germany. These cases were actually made by the Swiss in 1994, which they hated the idea that it said made in Germany on the dial at the time. But anyway, big date, key design feature on this watch, based on the Semper Cathedral in Dresden, which has this big date window there in the cathedral. And I just love the logo. Look how beautiful that logo sits on the dial. You know, that's a brand that's a bit of an insider brand. They produce between 3,000 to 6,000, 4,000-ish watches a year. And this for me is a keeper, as they say. This is a keeper. I got married in this watch last year, the Vacheron 1921. For me, pure elegance. It's a fascinating design that never ceases to polarize. I typically err on the side of sort of more elegant, dressier watches. This is a tool watch at its core with a really interesting story. People see the advertising from Vacheron. I don't know where we're going to send this video once we've recorded. Let's hope not to some of the brands, but you see it and you see it as a driver's watch, because when you hold the watch, it's designed in that way. But that's a story that's developed over the years at Vacheron. But the truth is, this is a watch that came out of the war, the First World War, because pocket watches began their lives in the pocket, in the trenches. The soldiers needed to, they realized it was just dangerous to be pulling a pocket watch out and not to have their heads up. So they started soldering lugs onto their watches and putting it on their wrist. And in 1921, Vacheron launched this to the American market, which was a watch that the soldiers, or at least the marketing team at Vacheron, thought would connect with the American market, because they knew what it was like to wear a watch that was off-center. Because a pocket watch has the crown at 12. So if you imagine, the soldiers would have turned it like this, and they soldered the lugs on. And we've seen designs like this from other brands like Waltham and others. But to me, this is just so sexy. And I love it. And it's a manually wound watch, so you have to wind it at 12 there, or 12 there on the corner. And it's just exquisite. 4400 caliber from Vacheron. Kari Voutilainen, one of the best independent watches, said that might have been the most beautiful in-house development caliber in the world. So easy to work on and very, very beautiful. Laurent Ferrier that we mentioned top right there, you know, an independent brand founded by Laurent Ferrier himself, an ex-Le Mans race driver based in Switzerland. Seamless elegance. This case is called the Gallet case. It's like a pebble in the hand. It is ridiculously elegant and beautiful. I mean, it oozes, like, to the point that those markers just could not be more elegant if they tried, in my view. This was launched a few weeks ago. This is the watch I've got coming in 2024. Hopefully I'll have enough money for it when it arrives. This is the watch I've got on here today, the AP. I'm really into Porsche design from IWC, because this was an era where Günter Blumlein was still there. Porsche design were looking for, the designers at the time were doing great work, but they were looking for a watch partner. And IWC has always innovated around materials. And these two watches, funnily enough, are not dissimilar to one another here. Both innovations on a material perspective, titanium on the left and ceramic on the right there. And this was a watch on the left here that was issued to German divers that could go to 2,000 meters, which in the 80s and 90s was a remarkable achievement, quite thin as well, 42 millimeters. And the one on the right is the 3705 ceramic. Don't know if you guys at home can actually see all of these, but bottom right here, this is the first ceramic pilot's watch ever made at IWC. And 1994, and this is a 39 millimeter watch. So for me, the perfect size. Become quite collectible. They made 999 of these in ceramic with different date wheels for different countries. And I just picked this one up from the Far East, and it's always been on my hit list. It wasn't the first ceramic watch that IWC ever developed. They did use and pioneer ceramics in the Da Vinci in the late 80s, which was a bit of an oddball. But you know, if you find a ceramic Da Vinci, pick them up, because that's a really interesting watch with a great bit of history. And then finally, the one above it is the Octo Finissimo, a design clearly from Genta's playbook. The Genta family heritage, etc., was acquired by LVMH, Bulgari, a couple of years ago, and they started innovating around this particular watch. Now, I think this is one of the more interesting case studies in design and technical execution in the last decade. It's 10 years old, this design now. This was launched a few weeks ago, and it's the Sketch 40 millimeters, beat blasted, incredible product in the hand and on the wrist. So there we go, guys. Sorry, you basically indulged me just to talk about everything that I love there for I don't know how long. But thank you for that. If there's any questions, please let me know.
Yeah. Do we have any questions? Any Zoomies?
I thought we were going to have the one-to-one conversation.
Sorry, forgive me.
No. Is it a Q&A or?
Yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely. If you have any questions, let's dive in.
I was curious about the titanium watch design, to be honest, because I've never seen that before. And what's the story for you in that particular piece? I mean, I know it seems like you have quite a connection with, you know, the innovation of the materials in IWC in particular, but what's the story?
Yeah, that watch. So I'd always wanted to interview this guy who's a bit of a hero of mine in the media space. A guy called Christian Hagen, a Danish guy who's sort of in his 30s, 40s, 50s. But he encapsulated kind of what I always thought would be my dream view on the watch world, which was fun, relaxed, stylish, you know, just a little bit different Danish vibes, right? And I got to interview him once at the IWC store in Bond Street, and we talked about digital innovation. And he rocked up with a slow beat big pilot, so a 5002 from 2002, the very first big pilot. And on the other wrist, this Ocean 2000. And I just looked at it, and it actually, while the photo has the bracelet there, which is an amazing bit of design, it also comes on a Velcro strap, for diving, so going over your dive suit. And I just loved it. From the moment I saw it on him, I thought, that's really weird. The way it sits is odd. It looks like a bit of a bulb. It looks quite organic. And that's when I went away and started reading about it. And it's amazing that the history of it, some of them were issued, they're called Bundweiler. They were issued to the German divers with a red stamp on the dial. So if you ever see those, you know those were military issued watches. It was an incredible piece of innovation, you know, as I say, quite thin as well. Porsche design, you know, the integration with Porsche design at the time, there was actually an ownership balance with IWC at the time. They were owned, it was pre-Vendôme. They were actually owned by the same company as Porsche design. So maybe this was the first ever internal group collaboration. And yeah, I just find IWC's technical material innovation to be fascinating. There aren't many brands that have that type of history. And we can forget that really quick when we see some of the things that are being offered today, or we don't question why they have so many black watches or colored ceramics, but they have that lineage. And I think that's really, really interesting. And so I bought that watch off Christian. So in lockdown 2 years ago, when I had absolutely no cash in the bank whatsoever, he said, by the way, I know you always loved that Ocean 2000 of mine. If you'd like it, I'll sell it to you. I was like, oh God. Not only is it a watch that I think is really cool and interesting, but it's coming from the guy that kind of has inspired me for the last few years. So I thought, I've got no option. I said, do you take Amex? He's like, no, we don't take Amex. And then so I had to find the money and paid him and got it. And honestly, it's great. You know, I look down at it and I see that friendship that we now have. And I see that trajectory, that journey when I see the watch, as cliche as that sounds.
Thank you. Yeah, it was amazing.
But also one of the most beautiful dive watches, I think. If you look at the dial, it's so beautifully balanced. Mine's got this, it's actually in the Hodinkee magazine, issue 3 or 4. They shot that very watch of mine. That was Christian's at the time, and it's very pumpkin-like. The way the tritium dial is aged is very, very pumpkin-like. And yeah, it's just a gorgeous dress watch that's so underappreciated in my view.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Questions?
It might be a bit philosophical in a way, but because it seems, and maybe it's an impression from your story, but your story or your career sort of intertwines with the, let's say, the ascent and importance, growing importance of social media, digitalization of the whole industry in a way, right? And you mentioned a couple of times the intertwining now and this growing trend of intertwining between the retail side of the industry, the media, social media side of the industry. So I just wonder if, from your point of view, how you see this going forward, and also in a personal sense, as a career standpoint, right? Because to me, it seems your position in terms of you deal with a lot of the agents in this industry, right? So how you see these pieces moving together, and if there's any north to that.
No, thank you. That's really interesting. And we didn't touch on any of that, you know, and it's such an important part of the journey for us as consumers and for me as an individual. Social media particularly has been amazing because it's been an opportunity to learn, but also to share the passion. And I think I certainly feel I trade on passion. And I think the vehicle we have for social is a great vehicle to share passion. We're seeing a shift, I think, from photography, which I love, and got into this as a photographer. I would knock on the doors, literally, of IWC. I was knocking down the door to just let me in to shoot some of these watches. So I'll send you the shots and you can use them as you want. This was before they had even a social account. And so I was really lucky that when they started the social account, they said, would you be prepared to shoot for us? So I'm not discounting photography, and I love photography, but it's increasingly becoming more about video. And it's increasingly becoming more about people and not about media outlets and anonymous views. And we're seeing, and I hate the term influencer, but we are moving towards a period of time where we consume more from individuals that we trust and connect with than we are from media outlets that we know, I think. And I certainly am seeing the brands shifting their interest to people that share their passions for the products that they make and wanting to work with them more closely. Seeing that this guy in Buenos Aires loves Grand Seiko and he's obsessed with Grand Seiko. How can we collaborate with him? How can we get to tap into his passion for our brand? That's the way in which I see things moving. But inevitably, the TikTok revolution, and I'm not on TikTok, but the way in which they see that virality going, we see Instagram, and I love watching the CEO talk on Instagram about how he's going to support the platform to keep moving forward. Short video is where they are supporting. Photography is not where they're supporting anymore. YouTube's been crazy for a lot of people who are sharing watch content or any specific interest on for the last 2 years. They've seen massive growth. And I remember some of my friends now who used to have a YouTube channel, they never got any love from Patek, from Rolex, from any of the big players, never invited them to anything. Suddenly, they're invited to things, right? You know, so there's been a real power shift and a balance that's gone on. What's happening in the future? I think we need to keep evolving. I think we need to keep evolving, and I think it needs to be a mix. I think of what I can bring to the table. It needs to be a beautiful print publication at the end of the year. It needs to be great photography, great storytelling. It needs to be relevant of the moment. And I get into trouble all the time for being attached to my phone. But the reality is, you need to take people on the journey with you. You have to be able to, as a brand or as an individual, take people on the journey. And I think people engage with being taken on a journey if they love the subject matter. So I think that's the future. But we have to keep evolving, because we stop, as Lange's tagline is, what do they say? You know, never stop moving forward or something. Never stand still. That's it. Never stand still. And as much as we hear that in business executive meetings the whole time, we have to keep evolving. Have to keep evolving.
Last question, I guess, for the day. You mentioned the rise of independence, and I think it's like, maybe it's just a phenomenon that I'm seeing, but more and more sort of big brands are sort of adopting that almost like independence approach, you know, pushing the boundaries, you know, being almost like, as you described, anti-hype. You know, you see that with, you know, a lot of Vacherons, a lot of Langes. And I think Richemont is a very compelling case in that sense, because it's a big conglomerate with loads of shareholders, but they're giving so much freedom to these brands, especially Vacheron and Lange. Do you see this trend sort of continuing across like the portfolio of brands? And do you think it only really works because Lange and Vacheron already have such a strong brand equity, so they can be a little bit more sort of daring, a bit more experimental? And
I think if they're able to present to us this idea of freedom or flexibility, I think they're doing a pretty good job at convincing us they have that freedom. I don't think they have as much freedom as we think they do. I know for a fact that every new design has to go to the board, and that has to be signed off. So I think I'm probably erring more towards the fact that their brand equity, specifically those two brands, are very distinctive and very clear. What we are seeing, I think, is each of those, particularly Richemont, and I've always connected with the Richemont brands for one reason or another. Maybe it's my South African lineage with Mr. Johan Rupert there at the helm of Richemont. But a few things about them is that they are becoming more distinct. IWC is becoming more IWC, I think, if that makes sense. They're driving more into their spaces that they see than ever before. Vacheron is moving into the artistic crafts more than ever before. So when you get triggered by these ideas, these emotions, if you are the type of buyer that wants something that's stealthy, that's street cook style, you know, you might think of a specific. I think that's what we're seeing more and more of. I know that they're notoriously bad at nurturing talent internally in the group. They have some amazing candidates, they have amazing staff and teams, but they're very poor at nurturing their people, I think. That's fair to say. Do they have the flexibility and freedom acting more like independents?
because, for instance, I know you have a close relationship with Wilma Schmidt.
Yes, yes.
Lange Söhne,
Yeah.
the CEO of Lange. So in your sort of conversations sort of with him, do you get the impression that Lange as a brand is getting a lot of sort of freedom from the parent company, Richemont?
I think that it's very intense. It's a very intense interaction. That they have limits to the number of watches that they're going to produce a year, and I think we're going to see an increase in unit price versus an increase in volume. And I think that plays a role with those two particular brands. For example, at Vacheron, I see the 222 now coming in, and I think that's going to wipe out a lot of the 56 that they were producing before. It's going to substitute in for the bits that maybe haven't been as popular. But yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, you know, from a leadership perspective, it's always difficult to understand what's actually happened there. I mean, let's not forget that the CEO at he was at JLC, then he went to Montblanc, and then he got promoted alongside Georges Kern. And this was 3-4 years ago, you might remember. And the two of them were joint heads of watchmaking in the group. And so they went to each of these brands and they directed them in a unified manner. And I know that ruffled some feathers, to the point that Georges left after less than 6 months in that role to put money into Breitling. And I know that's a very intense head-to-head. So it's very difficult now I think that we're seeing a more unified approach than ever before from the brands, particularly Richemont. LVMH is really interesting because you've got a number of family members heading up brands. I got the opportunity to sit in an interview with Frederic Arnault from TAG, who's 26, 27, he's the CEO there. And, you know, that's also a philosophical question there that we could talk about. But truth is, it's difficult to say. Do they have the autonomy and are they behaving like independents? Probably because they see that's where the market's moving.
Yeah, and we can have this conversation all day, but I guess just one sort of light-hearted question. Justin, do you have an exit watch? This is from Adrian in the chat.
Oh, Adrian, thanks for peppering me this evening. For a long time, you know, and it's always a conversation people have with you, you know, there's always conversation around the Grail watch. I think it's twofold. Number one, I feel like the desire to own everything, that sense, that human sense, the collector sense that I've got in me to own everything, has been softened by being around these things more often, by photographing them, and by sharing them. I don't necessarily feel the need to own them as I once did. That said, I also believe I own the watch that is closest to my heart, and I think it's the Lange 1. Even though I should probably say the 1921. It's a very close battle, but I think the Lange 1 in platinum for me, and I have heard Ben Clymer of Hodinkee say this before publicly, that if he were not in the watch industry and he had one watch, it might be the Lange 1. Not the Grand Lange 1. I own the Grand Lange 1 at 40.1 millimeters. The 38.5 is absolute perfection.
All right, I think we can have this
Great
conversation.
choice.
So let's just end it there. And if you guys want to follow Justin on social media, you can find him. Just Google his name. Come up. He's on Instagram.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for spending the evening with me. It's
thank you so much for your patience today. I know we had a bit of a technical issue at the start, but yeah, hopefully we can smooth things out for our next event. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.